My name is Carlos Amorales. I'm a Mexican artist. I am a visual artist, but I like to work in different media. So a lot comes from drawing and writing, but I like to do performance, I like to do installations, video, and also I'm very interested in music. Yeah, it all started with a project I did in Holland for the last years, where I wanted to collaborate with singers. I was very interested in, let's say, musicians who are not playing with instruments, but are just playing, they use their body as their own instrument. And I'm not a musician, so I had to find a language I could communicate with them, so I could communicate my ideas with them and kind of understand what they were also trying to give me. So for this exhibition, I had the chance to develop it further. I just tried to really, first of all, try to understand how to work with words and how you make them into songs, and then how these songs you can translate them or represent them visually. So I thought one of the best ways to start is to find a story. I got to meet the singer I work with, and when I met her and through her presence, I thought I got this idea of a deity or some sort of god or goddess that would create sculpt rocks, it creates shapes with the voice. And I thought, oh, that's almost like a fundamental idea, something very, could be primitive or really like the origin of a world or something. And then I started to research if such a myth would exist, and I realized that it didn't exist. But I went just further, and I thought, well, that's really exciting. Maybe I'm inventing some kind of mythology that could start or become something, which of course is a fantasy. But then the idea developed in the image, not really a god in the sense of a person, of a human, but more of an animal, of a big snake. And I thought this snake would be like carving the underground, like making this, which, I mean, you have the ambiguity of what is the underworld as the inferno, or this kind of substrata, or also the underground, which we also use, for instance, for music, like underground music or the underground scene. And since the exhibition was going to happen in New York, I wanted to have this ambiguity. So it could be like the underground as a cultural phenomena, or it could be as a more mythological phenomena. But then the story developed as this big snake that was carving and building with her voice, the underground. Then I understood that snakes have a very important presence in many, many mythologies. I guess you have it in India, but you also have it in Japan. And of course, we also have it in Mexico. We have a super strong myth, which is the myth of Quetzalcoatl, which is like a feathered snake. I just had this myth. I just had basic text to start with. And of course, for a song, you don't sing a text, just you sing more a poem. You have to give it a shape. So I just kept working on the poem. I did 2 songs out of this. They became more abstract and abstract. So the main text is really like a story. So it's telling you this story of the snake and and describing her. And then these 2 other songs just became really like poems. And what I asked the singer was to, we'll describe it as elongate the words and shape them into music, or into melodies. And we work in a very baroque manner, so it refers to a polyphony, so many voices together, kind of knitting between each other. And yeah, it came to this very holy kind of sound, it sounds a bit like Middle Ages music, or what we call, in Spanish, they're called madrigal, which is the music from the Middle Ages. And yeah, and then I started to approach what I wanted in the first place, which was to touch a much more spiritual kind of feeling or a spiritual kind of result, which is what fascinates me a lot of singing and choirs and this kind of polyphonic voice, which it almost feels like if the voice becomes like a material, it becomes almost like a gas. It starts to have a presence, but at the same time it's completely material. So it's something very sublime. That's very much what I think this show was about, reaching that and trying to represent that. Yes, the show is mainly like a video installation, not with screens and projectors, but what I used was this very old-fashioned like cube monitors, which are very beautiful. So it's like in monitors. And then together with these monitors, there is this quite large installation of painted papers. So it's like, in a way, it's a very massive show. It's quite big. It takes the whole space. So there like a big image. But on the other hand, it's a very light show because it's about the voice and it's about drawings on paper. Something is very, I would say like almost transparent, almost like very light. So my first thing was to make the music, to work with the singers, and I worked with the percussionist. And what he did was to play with his own body, like to percute his own body. So it became like a very nice contrast between, let's say, the very holy voice and the very earth kind of material sound of the body itself. So it becomes a contrast there. And then my question was how to represent this, how to represent especially the voice. And I thought, well, the voice is exhaled from the body, and when we use, for instance, a spray can, we exhale the paint. And it's like a funny conclusion, but I thought, well, it's maybe a way to express it. So there is I mentioned it because there is a nice contrast between this very light, beautiful Japanese paper that I use, which are sometimes 3.5 meters, so it's really, really high. And then how I painted these profiles of faces, which represent the singers, and I paint them with spray. So it's like almost like street culture meets something very refined. So it's like a clash of things, and so I think this contrast play a role in the exhibition. Like it looks rough, but on the other hand, it has something very subtle. So it has like all these differences. And you basically enter, and of course there is not a choir, but it's a painted choir. So you have like all these, there are like 40 drawings with all these faces, and even the faces represent many people. So it's like a choir of many choirs. And I have to say I was very impressed by something like an historical situation that I was told that happened in the Baltic countries when the Soviet Union collapsed, that the way they fought for their independence was by singing, because they have this very strong singing culture. So just people start to gather. So it's called the Singing Revolution. And I thought like super nice. Like this is really amazing because it's really about how you can find social change through something artistic, in this case singing. And it seems like it was so impressive at the moment that the Soviet troops just couldn't do anything. They just had to fight against singing people. So they wouldn't, they just stopped it and got back up. So I wanted to convey that. And I also think, like in the last years, the idea of mass and the idea of the multitude, the crowd, like a large amount of people has become very important, especially because of the pandemic. That's one question, it really affected a large quantity, but then also because all this social trouble, like all these things that were going on, like through For instance, what happened with George Floyd, like all this movement is being very strong. So in a way, I wanted to talk about that, to research a bit how art represents the multitude, how art represents the crowd. Like for instance, in Mexican muralism, which was almost like a branch of social realism, you have like very strong images of crowds, of demonstrations. And lately, we have become more and more into the image of the individual. It has become much more like a sort of narcissistic kind of representation. So I wanted to play a bit with that. I mean, collaboration has been important to me since many years, like almost since the beginning, because I think it's a way to open your own limitations. It's really basically by joining with somebody else, you create something bigger. And also, I've been interested in the way like visual arts connect to other arts. So that's also very important because, I'm not, let's say, the artist who's just busy with painting and the problems of painting or sculpture. So I really like this kind of, perhaps maybe more based in theater, like how theater brings together the visual, the performative, the music, the text, or cinema also. So I think in that sense, my ambition has always been more like a collaborative ambition. But what is interesting is that every art or every art form or every profession has its own language, has its own ways, its own, like musicians think musically, I think visually, and the writer thinks in words. And it's like basic differences, but that makes it very strong. You have to find bridges to connect. So always, let's say, to start collaborations, for instance, with a musician, I can have a picture in my head of more or less what I want, and it's very intuitive, but I cannot just write the music, like, and tell him or her, like, I need this. So you have to find like these bridges, this kind of common language, or start to learn their language. That's the other way. So for instance, with Diego, he helped me a lot in the last project, in the project with the choirs that I did in Holland. And he basically was educating me, so he was teaching me music. And that was like super generous of him because he really acted like a teacher. And that, for instance, allowed me that later when I contact Sarmen and I proposed her to collaborate, I had a much more notions and a sense to really tell her what I want. Perhaps not exactly in musical language, I cannot write music, but I had the terms, I had the ways to communicate. So that made it much more possible. It was also great working with her because we could meet every week for the last months. So that really gave a continuity. And I think that also helps a lot in artistic collaborations. And with her, and it's very nice how you mention it because it's not just like you hire somebody because it really becomes not only a collaboration, but it's something you build together, like for instance, I wrote the text, but she gave it the musical sense and that created a song. So it really, you blend together. I think it's something that comes very intuitive to me, maybe through experience and also I think through personal but also family history. My grandfather was Basque and he spoke Basque and then he moved to Mexico and he had to learn Spanish. So there was like this very foundational thing of, let's say, one person in my family that had to change his language. And for me, it was a bit the same because I was born in Mexico, but then my parents went to study in England when I was 3 years old. So they took me there. So I had to switch and learn like English. But then when I came back to Mexico, I had to kind of forget my English and learn again Spanish. And then when I was 19, I moved again to Europe. And then I ended up living in Holland for many, many years, like 10 years or something like that. So language has become really like a question because of course it's something you need to understand. You need to, if you want to communicate or even if you want to survive, the big principle is to learn, to understand. But another effect, which is very strong, is the non-understanding, the impossibility to understand. which I think is what creates like a very strong notion of foreignness. Is when you feel like completely a foreigner, when you don't grasp the language. And if I go to a country like Japan, for instance, or China, I don't understand even the text or the words. So it becomes really like a barrier, something where I'm completely foreign to it. So I think that is what I've been interested, how to express that. It's also, to me, it has also an emotional component. So it's about a sort of impossibility of communication, but that creates like an impossibility of agency. Like you cannot do things, you're not allowed, you're always too late. There is this kind of being a bit outside of reality. You cannot be in the present because you're thinking, what is the present? Like you are always a bit outside. In a way, I've been really following that, trying to understand that. And I think, sometimes the approach is more rational, sometimes it's more conceptual, but I think what is at the end there is kind of this need, I will say, to try to express a sort of existential condition. That's what I feel. Of course, I was shortly there, and I don't live in New York, so I couldn't go back. Sometimes when you exhibit in your hometown, you can have this opportunity to go back to the exhibition and go incognito and like listen to what people say, and it's really interesting. But in this time I didn't have. I felt a nice reception. I felt people were interested. We had especially the day after the opening, we had a talk with who was my former teacher, Joan Jonas. And it was really great because we have a very nice crowd, and it was a really nice way to be there and show the exhibition and talk about the exhibition with her and with the guests. And that I felt very great. I feel this show has something which is very strange because I'm not at all a religious person. I was not educated religiously. My parents decided to become atheists, so I really don't have this connection. But in a strange way, and maybe it's because of the way the voice is used in churches and stuff, in a way it has something more spiritual. And I will say it even has like nods or like details that connect to religion in a strange way. For instance, there is a book which I wrote and with all my notations and my visual exploration. But this book became kind of where everything's come from. So of course you can say, okay, there is the Torah, there is the Bible, like there is this book idea, no? Then there is the snake, the myth, this foundational myth. There is these voices kind of floating on air. Then there is this guy who's hitting himself. So it reminds me a bit about this self-flagellation, like this kind of whipping yourself. So it has a lot of details, and if you start to connect it, I think it's not pointed to one religion, but it has a bit the feeling of a religious experience. And I was wondering why, because it's not the kind of things you do consciously. And I was wondering, for instance, if it's something to do with the experience of the pandemic, like with being 2-3 years under this pressure and fear of something so big. So I feel that's there, but not let's say as something, not as horror, not as a political question, but more as kind of almost like a way to sublime it, a way to release. So to me, it's a show that's more about releasing. It's more about taking off the burden, like finally getting rid of the fear. And yeah, I hope people feel that, but I would like people to somehow take from this exhibition.